In the winter of 1227, somewhere beneath the frozen grasslands of Central Asia, a burial party carried a body to an unmarked grave. No monument was raised. No inscription was carved. According to the accounts left behind, the men who dug that grave were killed to keep its location secret, and the soldiers who killed them were killed in turn. To this day, no one knows exactly where that grave is. And yet the man buried in it had, in the space of 2 decades, built something the world had never seen before and would never see again. An empire so vast that a single rider could cross it and still not reach its edges before growing old. That man was Genghis Khan. And what makes his story almost impossible to believe isn't just how fast his empire rose, it's how fast it disappeared. Within 150 years, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the gates of Vienna, would fracture, collapse, and vanish from the map almost as quickly as it had appeared. Cities that had once trembled at the mention of the Mongol name would forget they had ever been ruled from Karakoram at all. And the question that still haunts historians today is deceptively simple. How does an empire that conquers nearly a third of the known world lose it all in less time than a single human lifetime? To understand the fall, you first have to understand the almost unimaginable scale of what was built. Picture the world in the year 1200. Europe is fractured into feuding kingdoms. China is split between rival dynasties. The Islamic world stretches in a patchwork of caliphates and sultanates. And in the harsh, wind-scoured steppes of Mongolia, small nomadic clans are locked in an endless cycle of raiding, blood feuds, and betrayal. Nobody in any of the great civilizations of the world is paying much attention to what's happening out there. That indifference would turn out to be one of history's great miscalculations. A boy named Temujin was born into that world of clan warfare, the son of a minor chieftain who was poisoned by rivals when the boy was still young. What followed was not a childhood, it was survival. Abandoned by his father's own tribe, hunted by enemies, forced at one point to flee with his family into the wilderness, Temujin learned early that loyalty on the steppe was fragile and power was the only real currency. According to Mongol oral tradition, later written down in the secret history of the Mongols, he even killed his own half-brother in a dispute over food, a brutal, formative act that some historians point to as the moment his ruthless political instincts began to take shape. By his mid-40s, that same boy, scarred, hardened, and relentlessly strategic, had done something no one on the steppe had managed in centuries. He had united the warring Mongol and Turkic tribes under a single banner. In 1206, at a great gathering of chieftains, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title often translated as universal ruler. It wasn't just a new king. It was a new kind of state, built from people who had spent generations trying to kill each other. What Genghis Khan built next wasn't just an army. It was a machine unlike anything the medieval world had encountered. The Mongol military ran on speed, discipline, and information. 3 things their enemies consistently underestimated. Mongol horsemen could travel distances in days that other armies took weeks to cross, living off mare's milk and dried meat, moving in coordinated units directed by a signaling system of flags and whistling arrows that let commanders redirect thousands of riders in the middle of a battle. Their composite bows, engineered from horn, wood, and sinew, could outrange most European crossbows of the era. And critically, Genghis Khan had an instinct that most conquerors of his time lacked. He understood that talent mattered more than tribal loyalty. Engineers, doctors, and administrators from conquered peoples were absorbed into the empire rather than slaughtered, and it was often these captured specialists, particularly Chinese siege engineers, who gave the Mongols the ability to do what steppe armies had never done before: break walled cities. City after city fell. Some surrendered and were spared. Others resisted and were made into examples so severe that word of what happened there would travel ahead of the army, encouraging the next city to open its gates rather than fight. Contemporary chroniclers describe staggering death tolls in cities like Merv and Nishapur, though modern historians debate just how literally those numbers should be taken, since medieval writers on all sides had strong incentives to inflate the scale of both victories and atrocities. What isn't disputed is the psychological effect. Fear became one of the empire's most effective weapons, often doing as much work as the army itself. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, in that unmarked grave whose location remains one of history's enduring mysteries, his empire already stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast of China. And remarkably, this was still just the beginning. His successors didn't slow down, they accelerated. Under his son Ojdai Khan, the Mongols pushed westward with terrifying momentum, sweeping through Russia's principalities, crushing Polish and German knights at the Battle of Legnica, and shattering a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi in the same year. European chronicles from the period describe a continent gripped by genuine panic. Rumors spread of an unstoppable force some called the Tatars, a name deliberately linked in the medieval imagination to Tartarus, the underworld of Greek mythology. Historians note that by 1241, Mongol scouting parties had reportedly been seen within striking distance of Vienna, and European kingdoms braced for what many assumed would be the fall of Christendom itself. And then, almost inexplicably, the Mongols turned back. It wasn't a European victory that saved Central Europe. According to most historical accounts, it was news arriving from thousands of miles away. Ojdai Khan had died. Mongol succession law required that senior princes and commanders return to Mongolia to participate in selecting the next great Khan. So the army that seemed poised to reshape European history simply withdrew, redirected by a political crisis unfolding on the other side of the continent. It's one of history's great what-ifs, a moment where the fate of an entire civilization may have hinged not on armies or walls, but on a single death and a rigid rule of succession. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it points directly to the empire's deepest, most persistent weakness, one that would eventually bring the whole structure down. The Mongol Empire had no fixed system of hereditary succession, the way most settled civilizations did. Instead, a new great Khan had to be formally elected by a council of nobles called a Kurultai. In theory, this was meant to ensure the most capable leader took power. In practice, across an empire spanning thousands of miles, it meant that every single transition of power was a moment of genuine danger, an opportunity for rival princes, distant governors, and ambitious generals to advance their own claims, stall campaigns, or quietly begin building independent power bases while the center was distracted. At its height under Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, the empire's sheer scale had already made this problem almost unmanageable. By then, the Mongol territories had informally split into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty ruling China and Mongolia, the Chagatai Khanate across Central Asia, the Ilkhanate covering Persia and the Middle East, and the Golden Horde stretching across Russia and the Eurasian steppe. On a map, this still looked like one empire. In practice, these were increasingly separate states, ruled by cousins and descendants of Genghis Khan who often had more interest in fighting each other than cooperating. This is where the story stops being simply a tale of conquest and becomes something closer to a slow-motion political collapse, and it's worth pausing here to appreciate what actually held the empire together while it lasted. For a brief, remarkable window, the Mongols presided over something historians now call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. With the trade routes of Eurasia unified under a single political umbrella for the first time in history, merchants could travel from the Mediterranean to the Pacific coast of China with a degree of safety that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. It was this network that allowed a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo to travel to the court of Kublai Khan and later produce an account of Mongol China that fascinated and astonished Europe. Ideas, technologies, and goods moved with the trade caravans, gunpowder formulas, paper-making techniques, astronomical knowledge, and artistic styles all traveled farther and faster than they ever had before. In many ways, the Mongol Empire briefly stitched together a version of the ancient world's first great globalization. But that same network of interconnected roads and trade routes that made the empire prosperous would also become one of the mechanisms of its undoing. In the 1340s, a catastrophic disease began spreading along Mongol trade routes out of Central Asia. Historians and scientists studying the Black Death now widely believe that the same infrastructure that had allowed silk, spices, and ideas to move rapidly across the continent also allowed a deadly pathogen to travel with unprecedented speed. Some accounts describe a Mongol army besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Black Sea, catapulting plague-infected corpses over the city walls. A possible, though historically debated, early instance of biological warfare that may have helped seed the disease's spread into Europe. Whether or not that specific episode was the primary trigger, the broader pattern is well documented. The plague moved along Mongol-controlled trade corridors, and within a few catastrophic years, it would kill an estimated third of Europe's population and devastate communities across Asia and the Middle East as well. The empire that had connected the world had also, unintentionally, connected it in the worst possible way. By the mid-14th century, the cracks that had been forming for decades were turning into fault lines. In China, the Yuan dynasty, the branch of the empire ruled by Kublai Khan's descendants, was struggling under the weight of its own contradictions. Mongol rulers had never fully integrated with the much larger Chinese population they governed, maintaining a rigid social hierarchy that placed Mongols and allied foreigners above the ethnic Chinese majority. Combine that persistent resentment with catastrophic flooding of the Yellow River, crushing tax burdens used to fund lavish court spending, and a demoralized economy weakened by both plague and mismanagement, and you have all the ingredients for rebellion. That rebellion came in waves throughout the 1350s, as peasant uprisings, many organized under secret religious societies, spread across China. One of these rebel leaders, a former Buddhist monk-turned-warlord named Zhu Yuanzhang, proved more disciplined and more ruthless than his rivals. By 1368, his forces had captured the Yuan capital at Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, forcing the last Yuan emperor to flee north into Mongolia. Zhu Yuanzhang would go on to found the Ming Dynasty, and just like that, less than a century and a half after Genghis Khan had first united the Mongol tribes, the crown jewel of the empire, China itself, was gone. But China's fall wasn't an isolated collapse. It was the most visible symptom of a disease that had been spreading through the entire Mongol system for generations. To the west, the Ilkhanate ruling Persia had already dissolved by the 1330s, undone by succession disputes so severe that the Khanate essentially disintegrated into competing regional warlords rather than being conquered from outside. Persian and Islamic culture, which the Mongol rulers had partially absorbed and converted to, ultimately outlasted Mongol political control entirely. Further north, the Golden Horde, which had dominated Russian principalities for over 2 centuries, was gradually worn down by internal power struggles and by the rising power of a once subservient vassal state, the Grand Duchy of Moscow. What had begun as a tribute-paying, subjugated territory would eventually grow strong enough to challenge and ultimately break free from Mongol overlordship, a process historians often mark symbolically with events like the Great Standing on the Ugra River in 1480. The moment Moscow effectively stopped paying tribute to the descendants of the Golden Horde altogether. Even the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the branch of the empire that arguably stayed closest to traditional Mongol nomadic customs, eventually split into rival factions and lost cohesive central authority. So what actually killed the largest empire in history? The honest answer, supported by most modern historians, is that no single cause did. It was a convergence of structural weaknesses that had existed since the very beginning, finally catching up with an empire that had simply grown too large, too fast, to sustain itself. The absence of a stable, agreed-upon succession system meant that virtually every transfer of power carried the risk of civil war. The sheer geographic scale of the empire, spanning multiple climates, languages, religions, and cultures, meant that maintaining centralized control required a level of administrative coordination that medieval communication technology simply could not support. As individual khanates increasingly absorbed the local cultures, religions, and governing systems of the peoples they had conquered, they gradually became less Mongol and more Persian, more Chinese, more Russian, until the very identity that had once bound them together began to dissolve from within. And the plague, when it came, didn't create these weaknesses. It exploited and accelerated ones that had already been quietly eating away at the empire's foundations for decades. There's also a deeper, more uncomfortable pattern that historians point to when comparing the Mongol collapse to other great empires throughout history. Empires built primarily through rapid military conquest, without the corresponding development of durable political and economic institutions to bind their territories together long-term, tend to be inherently unstable. Some historians suggest the Mongol Empire is one of history's most extreme examples of this principle, proof that even the most overwhelming, seemingly unstoppable military force cannot indefinitely hold together a system that lacks the administrative glue to survive its own success. Other scholars push back on framing it purely as an institutional failure, pointing out that the Mongols did develop sophisticated systems of governance, communication, and law, the Yasa legal code, and the Yam relay postal system among them, and argue the empire's fragmentation had as much to do with geography and sheer distance as with any inherent flaw in Mongol statecraft. The debate over exactly how much weight to give each factor remains active among historians today, and it's unlikely to ever be fully settled, precisely because an empire this vast collapsed for reasons that were themselves as vast and varied as the territory it once controlled. What makes the story so enduringly fascinating isn't just the scale of what was built or the speed of what was lost. It's the strange, quiet afterlife the empire left behind. The Mongols didn't vanish so much as they were absorbed into the very civilizations they had once conquered. Their descendants ruled parts of India for centuries afterward under the Mughal dynasty, whose name is itself a variation of Mongol. Their genetic legacy, according to some population genetics research, may be traceable in a strikingly large number of people living across Asia today, a controversial and still debated finding that continues to be studied and questioned by scientists. Trade routes they secured planted the seeds for centuries of Eurasian exchange that followed. And the raw historical memory of what they achieved, and how quickly they lost it, has echoed through the centuries as one of history's starkest warnings about the fragile relationship between conquest and control. Because in the end, an empire that once stretched further than any before it, feared by every civilization it touched, was undone not primarily by a rival army defeating it on some decisive battlefield, but by the same forces that quietly test every empire in history: succession, distance, assimilation, and time. Genghis Khan built something no one believed was possible, a nation forged out of centuries of tribal bloodshed, capable of humbling the greatest cities and armies on earth. And yet within 150 years, his descendants would watch as the very thing he built came apart in their hands, piece by piece, until all that remained were fragments scattered across a continent, slowly absorbed back into the civilizations they had once ruled. Somewhere out there, beneath ground that has never been found, lies the man who started it all, a grave without a marker, for an empire that, in the end, left behind more questions than answers. So here's what's worth sitting with. If the largest, Most feared empire in human history could rise in a single generation and unravel within a few more. What does that say about the empires and institutions we assume are permanent today? Is total collapse simply the fate that eventually awaits every empire that grows too fast to sustain itself? Let us know what you think in the comments.